Hey, it's been a while, so it's about time we talked about a subject that interests me enormously. Suspensions. First of all, you need to know that a suspension is always made up of two elements, a spring and a hydraulic part, as seen here inside. So today we're going to concentrate on the spring part, and in this case we're talking about a coil spring, but it works exactly the same way on an air shock absorber or an air fork. There's also the hydraulic part and the spring part, which is more on the outside, and it is an air spring. So we often make the mistake of saying that it's an air suspension, but in fact it's simply the spring that's air, and here it's a spring that we'll call helical. So those are the main differences between these two machines. Let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of one over the other. First of all, the helical spring is the simplest to study, because it's so simple to operate. When it's in its resting position, it emits no force, but when you start to crush it, it will emit a force proportional to the amount of crushing, but in the opposite direction, i.e., the more you crush it, the more it will resist and try to return to its initial position. So it's very simple to translate with a few mathematical equations. Yes, we'll be looking at some mathematical equations today. You don't have to understand them. Just because you don't understand the score doesn't mean you can't listen to the music. And the music is really good, so keep listening anyway. So here we have a little equation that links us in the end to crush versus force. To this we can add the fact that we know from Newton's laws that the resultant force is equal to mass times acceleration. This allows us to write a little equation linking acceleration to the crushing of our shock absorber, which is position. We also know that position and acceleration are linked by successive derivatives, since acceleration is the derivative of velocity and velocity is the derivative of position. This gives us a system of differentiated equations with three equations that we could have fun solving, but that's not all we have to do. We put this into a computer and see what happens. What's going to happen is that we're going to have oscillations that never stop. So you're going to tell me that doing all these mathematical equations is pointless, because in the end, all you had to do was experiment and realize that, yes, a spring does that too. But then it's true, you're right, and in fact, what we're really interested in is the conclusion that, in fact, a spring is pretty stupid. Because if we disturb it here from its resting position, in fact, if we disturb it, it'll try to return to its resting position, but it's incapable of stopping there. And this is proof that a spring is completely stupid. Spring. So now let's take a look at air suspension and the air spring. The main element of an air spring is an air chamber like this one. We're going to plug it here to really make a closed chamber here with a certain pressure. And we're going to notice that, in fact, when the suspension tries to return to its initial position, it's interesting to note that this behavior is somewhat similar to that of a spring, since it will try to return to its initial position. We've noticed here that there's no oscillation, but we'll come back to that later. A real suspension doesn't work in exactly the same way because there are two chambers, a positive and a negative one. So often you only need to inflate the positive chamber, but they'll both balance automatically. So why do we have two chambers? Because if you overinflate here, this chamber you're going to have to apply a lot of force to start the compression, and the more you inflate here, the harder it will be to start compression, which means you won't have any sensitivity at the beginning of the stroke. On the other hand, once you've started to apply sufficient force, you'll be able to enter the travel range and use it naturally. In fact, that's why we have two chambers here. Adjust our position, our bike's attitude, our motorcycle's attitude, but underneath we'll have the negative chamber, which will enable us to gain sensitivity because they'll be in balance, so we won't need to apply much force to start crushing the shock absorber. So that's the first element, and that's why we have two chambers. To study this suspension, we'll have to apply the law of perfect gases, PV equals nRT, where P is pressure and V is volume. So we're interested in pressure because it's analogous to a force. And what is pressure? It's a force on a unit of surface area. So we'll divide by the surface area. And at some point we'll be able to determine the force emitted by an air damper as a function of its compression. In fact, what you need to understand is that one chamber is compressed and the other, the negative chamber, is decompressed, which means that at the beginning it emits a force, but the further you go into the travel, the more its force is cancelled out. Finally, what we're interested in terms of force is the resultant of the two forces. one will decrease in the deflection and the other will increase. And that's when we realize that it's really important to have a negative chamber that's as large as possible, because if it's super small, it will very quickly be depressurized and have no impact. That's why we're going to have suspensions with curves at the start, with a kind of very rapid rise, and then the positive chamber which will rise in a kind of exponential form. This is due to the fact that in our formula, the crushing of the shock absorber is in the denominator. So that's why we often see enduro riders, when they're still using air suspension, often they don't have quite that shock, they have bigger ones, because the idea is to have the biggest negative chamber possible, and that's important for them, but not necessarily for everyone. But the idea is to have a bike that's very sensitive, and that's really going to be able to finally have a curve that matches as close as possible, with a coil spring at least at the start, and then at the finish with the possibility of shaping the end of the stroke to make it steeper and steeper, potentially if you need to, if you feel that sometimes there are big jumps and you want the suspension to accompany you on these big jumps. And that's the main difference with a spring, because a spring necessarily has a completely linear curve, and what you can eventually change is the steepness of this slope. What you can change is the steepness of the slope, but to change that, you have to change the spring completely. And that's a big hindrance if you don't have a budget, if you can't do testing, etc. It's pretty complicated to know which spring is the right one, so to change the slope you have to change the spring. Whereas here, to change the slope and the behavior, we're simply going to change the pressure or the spring rate. We're simply going to change the pressure or potentially change the size of the chambers by adding what we call tokens, i.e. reducing the chamber size simply by putting bits of plastic in there. So this is really good from a productivity point of view too, since all we need to do is make a single shock absorber, and that's fine for everyone. All we need to do is change the pressures and the air, which isn't expensive, whereas here we're really going to have to change the spring each time to be able to change its curves. On the other hand, once we've got our spring and it's well adapted to us, its behavior will never change over time. Whereas for a suspension, as we've seen, PV equals N0. T, for example, it's the temperature, i.e. this suspension will change its behavior according to the temperature, and that's only due to the spring, in fact. It's a big problem, and that's why sometimes certain enduro riders on big special stages such as Whistler, etc. had an air shock before, and on these big races they switched to a spring shock. One of the other big problems with these suspensions is that if you have a negative chamber that's too weak, you'll have no sensitivity or very little sensitivity anyway. And I've got a very good feeling here. This is a lot heavier than that. So that's another very important point. If you're looking for a super light bike, that's the best. But if you just want something that's reliable and always works the same, that's what's going to be more interesting. But be careful, it's not the same weight. We've pretty much said what we had to say, but we're still going to put everything we've just calculated into our computer to see what's going on. And we're going to that here too, it oscillates. Here too it oscillates. And in fact, it's the friction that's going to prevent oscillation. This friction, it's super interesting to have it. In my models, I don't have it. I didn't put any friction model. It is with these frictions that we are going to change the stupid behavior of the spring, since a coil spring or an air spring have both the same tendency to rebound. If we only had spring without hydraulic system, our suspension would react like this all the time. And what we need to understand is that a spring, whether coil or air, has exactly the same objective, which is to return the shock absorber to its resting position. This resting position will be our sag, our pre-stress as we call it in motorcycling, but that's the main objective. We see that it is complicated for a spring to do its job alone because it oscillates. The hydraulics, the second element of the suspension, is extremely important to adjust. And so, finally, if we're looking to adjust our sag or pre-stress, what do we do here? Here, first, we need the right spring. The best thing is to change the spring slope so that once we're on our bike, we're at 30% of travel if we want that number for sag position. What we can eventually do is to tighten it, but that's a bad idea because by tightening it, what actually happens is that the curve rises as you go along, and in fact you lose one of the great advantages of a helical shock absorber, which is sensitivity. The more we tighten it, the more we lose sensitivity. So the idea is to have it as free as possible to keep sensitivity, because this is a quality of coil shocks that we want to keep. It's not mandatory. Some people like to have a bike that's a bit hard at the top of the travel range and then dips easily into the travel range. It's not compulsory, but it's one of the enormous qualities of a coil spring, so it's a shame to lose it somewhere. Try to get the right spring, and here we're going to try to get the right base pressure. Once we've got the pressure right, there's not much we can do with it. The only thing we can do is possibly accompany the end of the stroke with tokens, that's all. Important element in a suspension isn't so much the spring as the hydraulics, and there are a huge number of possibilities here. But I think we'll talk about that in another video. I think I've said all I have to say on the subject. Bye!